Hello and welcome to this month's session on parenting with the brain in mind. Once again, my name is Josh McNeil, and I'm really excited to be able to spend this time with you today. What we're going to be exploring for this session is looking at this idea of parenting with brain plasticity in mind. And so we're going to be digging into an understanding of what we even mean by brain plasticity and what that all really looks like as we're trying to support kids. One of the things that I just want to say, kind of first and outright here, and I think that it's almost most important for this session than perhaps all of the sessions that we have done already and that we will be doing, is realizing that every single one of you that is watching this video, I realize is coming from a different place. Some of you are coming personally from different backgrounds. Also, you have children that are coming from different backgrounds. We take what's called a brain-based and trauma-informed approach to supporting children. And so some of you may have children or people within your care that you believe have had some type of trauma or neglect in their past. And some of you might say, no, like I've been with my child every step of the way, and I know that they don't have trauma. I know that they don't have neglect. I know what they've been through. And what I want to be clear about here is that as we really begin to dive into this content, a lot of that stuff doesn't matter. As we begin to really dive into understanding the brain, what we really want to pay attention to is the reality that our brains develop different ways for different reasons. They develop based on the things that we're experiencing. They develop differently because of genetics and epigenetics, which is what's actually written into our DNA, which presupposes our brains actually to develop different ways more readily than other people's might. And so there's all sorts of different things that can exist that can really cause brains to develop in different ways. And so kind of first and foremost, what we want to just be keeping in mind is that when we're talking about our children, we're really looking at it once again from this brain-based perspective, and we're realizing that it's not about pointing fingers, it's not about blame, it's not about anything like that, but it's about the realization that perhaps the reason behind some of their behavioral or social or academic issues that you might be feeling you're having with your children is probably because something related to how their brain is wired. And that doesn't mean that anything's broken. And once again, it doesn't mean that you did anything wrong, but it's just about realizing, okay, this is where we're at now. And our goal is to think through how can we really begin to rewire that? What are the steps that we can take to really support them in that process? And so that is what's super exciting about today's topic, is that we're talking about this idea of brain plasticity. And so with brain plasticity, what that means, if you're not familiar with the term, is that that is the brain's ability to positively change throughout life. What's interesting is that this is actually a fairly new term. Within the last 30 years or so is really when this term began to become known. And even more recently, people have been trying to accept it more and more. And so what we're really looking at here is this realization that our brains can improve all throughout life. It used to be believed that after a certain point, and really you're kind of talking, adolescence, 20s, 30s, your brain would kind of plateau. And then any change that would occur henceforward was actually decline. And so it's really an amazing revelation that they've seen that the brain can actually continue to improve, continue to enhance, continue to function better all throughout life. And the truth is, this provides a lot of hope, because sometimes, whether you're looking at your child or even thinking of yourself, we say, okay, it's just the way I am, or it's just the way they are, and nothing's ever going to change about that. And the truth is, no, the brain can change. The brain will change. What's fascinating for you all, if you have been, caring for a child for a number of years now, you have literally had a front row seat to brain plasticity and to brain development. The truth is, we don't, once again, think about it that way. We're not sitting there thinking like, oh, look at those neurons firing and changing. That's not typically how we think about it when we're looking at a child. But we're realizing that as you've seen them develop new skills, as you've seen them go from, eating only liquids to being able to eat solids to napping all the time to being able to stay awake during the day and sleep at night. As you've seen these different regulatory systems begin to improve and enhance, as you have seen new skills begin to form, you're literally watching the brain change and develop. If there was no exposure to new things, they wouldn't just naturally pick up on walking and eating and sleeping better. And those things wouldn't just automatically happen. They happen because they are exposed to more and more opportunities. They are given more and more support and assistance, and those changes occur. And so brain plasticity, especially in younger brains, when they are exposed to different things, is inevitable. And so I guarantee you, if you've spent any amount of time with a child, that you have had a front row seat to their brain changing. But our brains are very much going to be altered, once again, by their environment. And so sometimes they change in ways that we're really grateful of, and sometimes they change in ways that we're not as grateful of. I know as a parent, I have seen many times like, oh, wow, my kids are really picking up on some of my worst habits. And we see that kind of out of play in them. And I've joked many times that, your kids are really just a magnifying glass on some of the worst things about myself when it comes to like maybe how I handle frustration or stress or something like that. But the truth is, they are learning from us, and their brain is wiring then to try to understand what to do in different situations. And so that's just the nature of the brain and the nature of, once again, neurodevelopment and the opportunity that our brain takes to be able to change throughout time. And so once again, one of the places that we always like to start in all of these trainings is that basic understanding of the brain. And a big part of what I want to review right now quickly is just more about making sure that as we are thinking about our children, and especially as we are considering, things that we might perceive as being issues or areas of improvement, is just understanding what some of the kind of basic times of development are and what you can expect at different ages. And so when a child is first born, that's when they have kind of a fully developed brain stem. And so that is your basic life functioning. And that's all they're supposed to do. They're supposed to be able to eat and swallow. They're supposed to be able to breathe. They're supposed to be able to regulate their temperature and their heart rate. Like they're just supposed to exist. We're not expecting much else from them when they are first born. And over the first couple of years of life, then, that's where their midbrain development begins to occur. And so during that midbrain development in the first couple of years of life, that's where they begin to develop the framework, if you will, for their large and fine motor skills. That's one of the biggest things that we see in those first 2 years, where they begin to grab things, they begin to push themselves up, they begin to be able to walk typically, they are beginning to develop some of those skills. It's also during these first 2 years of life that they begin to improve their awareness to their internal regulatory systems. What I mean by that is they begin to be more aware of the fact that I'm hungry right now, I'm tired right now, I'm thirsty right now. There's systems that occur internally. They become more and more aware of those things, and they begin to understand how to solve some of those issues. So once again, that just because those skills are developing in those first 2 years does not mean that they are perfected in those first 2 years. You really spend a lot of time thereafter perfecting some of those skills. But once again, you can kind of think of it as the rough framework being put in place. And so the hope is that by about 2 years of age, you begin to improve a little bit on some eating habits, some sleeping habits, and things like that, where it's different than it was when they were first born, and they play a more active role in being able to support themselves in those areas. And then once you're about 2 to 3 years old, all the way up until about your 12 to 13 years old, your primary region of development then is the limbic level of your brain. And so I think it's really important to realize, first and foremost, this is a 10-year span. And so for most kids, during this 10 years, the social emotional part of their brain is developing. And the reason it's important to understand that this is such a wide span of time is that everyone's going to develop it here at a different rate. And so this is the time where your brain is learning how do I relate to others? How do I trust others? How do I treat others? How do I feel when I'm around other people? And then how do I handle frustration? How do I handle stress? How do I handle annoyances? How do I handle happiness and joy? What do I do with these emotions? What do I do with relationships? And the reason I like to really highlight the fact that this is a 10-year span is that you might look at your child and they could be, let's say, 8 or 9 years old. And then you meet a 5 year old and you're like, oh my goodness, this 5 year old has better emotional regulation than my 9 or 10 year old does. Or this 5 year old is better at making friends than my 9 or 10 year old is. It's okay. They are all within that timing in that framework there. I'm not saying that there's not the potential that there's something else at play, but the reality is just everyone's going to develop that at a different rate. And so don't get overly concerned. We are just expecting that over that kind of decade of time, that you're seeing notable improvement and continual growth in how they relate to others and how they handle their emotions. And so by the time they are 6, we hope it's a little better than they handled it when they were 2. By the time that they're 10, we hope it's a little bit better than how they handled it when they're 6. So once again, it's not about perfection. And it's not about comparing to every other child or being worried that a child who's chronologically younger is at a different spot there. But it's about making sure, first and foremost, that we're seeing positive improvement in those areas. And so that's a lot of what we're really looking at. And then once you hit that age of 12, from 12 to the end of adolescence, which if you recall from the first video, really can go into your early 30s, the primary region of development then is your cortical brain. This is your cortex. And so this is that highest level of thinking. And so this is the part of the brain you can really rely on to think before you act. This is the part of the brain that can think logically about things. This is the part of the brain that can do better long-term planning into the future. Now, here's the reality. The cortex was developing this whole time. It was never the primary region of development until those early teen years, but it was developing this whole time. And so it's not as if they could never think before they act before. It's not as if they could never do long-term planning before. But this is where it really, you should begin to see more and more leaps in some of that higher level of thinking. And so once again, just because you might have seen somebody who's the same age or even younger than your child when they were 8, 9, 10, 11 years old, who seemed to have greater cortical skills, that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with your child necessarily. It's once again just the different pace, the different rate. But as they get into those teen years and beyond, that's where we begin to want to make sure that we're seeing consistent growth once again in their capacity to think and to learn and to plan and to problem solve. That's where we want to really begin to see that growth occurring. And so I wanted to go through all of that again. For one, just to kind of give a little bit of a different perspective and dynamic. And I never want people to get overly concerned that, oh, there's a problem with my child. Everybody is going to develop differently. And typically speaking, there's some areas where your child may excel and other areas that might be a bit more of a deficit. And sometimes the things that they excel at are going to be a little bit more hidden at home, and the things that are a deficit or more out in the public view, or vice versa. And so we never know what other people are going through. All you know is what's happening at your own child with your own home. And so once again, I'm a big believer in not trying to overly compare to other things that may be kind of seemingly going on at that time. But as I described that, what we might realize is, you know what? There was kind of a plateau. By the age of 8, some of those motor skills, some of those self-regulatory skills, they never improved. The emotional skills stopped. When we see that perhaps there are some areas that either didn't go the way that we thought, or they developed skills to manage some stressors, some challenges that don't really align with the skills that we would want them to have, well, then what we're realizing is, okay, this is where we need to begin to make a shift. This is where we might need to begin to say, okay, we need to be a lot more focused on supporting that. A lot of things kind of develop pretty well naturally, but there's a time and a place to really discern, okay, how do I need to help and really specifically address some specific areas that I want to see some specific growth out of. And so I want to begin to talk a little bit more about some of how our brain develops, because I think that that's going to help us as we're beginning to uncover some of the things that we can do to create new neural pathways in the brain. And so there's this saying that you may have heard before. It says that neurons that fire together wire together. And so that's kind of a description of a lot of the basics of how it is that our brain functions. Our brain, we are born with 86 billion, with a B, billion neurons in our brain. And neurons, to put them most simply, are kind of these tiny little flashing dots that are, really experiencing the world and bringing in a memory of the world around us. And so multiple of these dots, when they fire off at the exact same time, they actually create these things called synaptic branches. They wire together, and that's what creates a full understanding, a full memory of something that is going on around you. And so as we are experiencing different things, we have external senses. So what we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we smell, what we're touching, at times even what we're tasting, we have those senses. And then we have our internal sensory. So our emotions, am I happy? Am I sad? Am I scared? Am I joyful? And all of those are attached to neurons. And so as we're experiencing something, we have all these neurons that are firing off. And when those neurons fire off at the exact same time, they wire together, and that's what creates a memory. And so, for instance, one of the classics and different memories more easily actually tied to emotions. Sorry. And one of the memories that really ties to emotions is your olfactory memory. So your smells. And so what's interesting is there's lots of times that you might, smell, freshly baked cookies, and immediately that brings joy to you or something like that. Like, it has this calming sense to have these different scents. Sometimes it gives you a cortical memory. So you remember, oh, this brings me back to being at my grandmother's house or something like that. Other times you're just like, oh, I just love that smell. And you're not necessarily being able to hone in on why you feel calmer now or why you feel happier, but because that thing is present. Conversely, sometimes you have memories that are then tied to something a bit more negative. And once again, sometimes it brings you back to the moment, sometimes it doesn't. But for instance, I was just in a car with a friend of mine, and we were driving along, and all of a sudden it started to snow. And they like tensed up. You could see them like physically begin to change and alter. And it wasn't until I kind of spoke to them a little bit that they're like, well, you know what, when I was younger, I got in a car accident when I was in the snow. And their brain wasn't right there until they really brought it up, but they had this very big emotion to it because they had neurons firing saying I'm in a car, neurons firing saying we're driving along, neurons. But then once that snow hit, neurons firing saying I'm in a car and it's snowing, all of a sudden that triggered the emotion to say, oh, we were in a car and in a really serious accident in a snowstorm once. And so the brain said, okay, now we might be in danger. So once that neuron fired off seeing the snow, all of a sudden it attached to all those other neurons that brought back the emotions of that moment. And emotionally, they were right back in that moment after the accident, even though at first they weren't thinking about or talking about the accident until, once again, we really talked a bit more through it. And so that's how these neurons work. And it's really amazing that our brain does that. Our brain does this because it wants to be efficient, and our brain does this because it wants to protect us. And so, for instance, if you've learned that certain people or places or animals are unsafe, and you had a bad experience or observed bad experiences of people, places, animals, etc., and then you all of a sudden become close to that area, see those people, you want your brain to immediately say, you're in danger, get out of here, instead of waiting to get harmed again. And so that's how our brain does. That's what our brain, operates this way to help preserve us, to help to keep us safe. But the problem is sometimes our brain can misfire here a little bit. Sometimes our brain tells us something is more dangerous than in reality it is, because it didn't necessarily understand the specific context of what happened in a previous environment, in a previous situation, or the realities of a new environment that they're in. This is a really big thing if you happen to be somebody who's adopted or in any type of foster care situation, is that a child was at home and their brain learned that the caregiver here might not be safe, might not be predictable, might not be somebody I can count on. And then they come into your home, and maybe you are 100% committed to being safe, to being predictable, to being loving, but their brain associates you with that other person. And once again, that doesn't mean that they're cognitively thinking, oh, you're just like all the others. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. But more, it's just that they are going to likely at times go right back lower in their brain and feel unsafe, feel uncared for. And specific moments, specific words, specific experiences might be more likely to bring some of those specific triggers up that were more, once again, closely situated with other experiences that they have had before. And so there's a couple of specific kinds of memory that I really want to talk through here. And most specifically, these fall under this umbrella of what you would call either procedural or implicit memory. And so procedural or implicit memory, that's a procedure or group of automatic actions occurring outside of your, kind of focused attention, in which words are generally not required or words are not really used to learn that thing. So classic example, riding a bike. If you learned how to ride a bike, and if you ever help somebody to learn how to ride a bike, what you know is that you don't just sit them down in a desk and say, okay, here's how you ride a bike. You put your hands here, put your feet here, you pedal, you try to balance and, be on your way. That might be a small part of it, but the truth is you don't expect to sit there and explain that to somebody and have them get on a bike and be able to ride it right away. They're never going to be able to do that. Instead, the only way to learn how to ride a bike is to get on a bike and start to practice. And there's different tools that you can use. There's, when I was a kid, I used training wheels. Now with my kids, I use balance bikes. There's tools like that that begin to kind of work in that way. But still, it's the same basic premise, which is you need to get on the bike and you need to try, and you're going to fall a handful of times, or at least kind of lean on and catch yourself. And so you need to learn that way. And literally what's happening is you get on that bike and your brain has neurons firing saying, this is where my hands go. Your brain has neurons firing saying, this is where my feet go. Your brain has neurons firing saying, this is how I balance. Your brain has neurons firing saying, this is how I steer. And so you have all of these neurons firing and then slowly wiring together as you're creating this procedural memory for how do I ride a bike? And after getting on a handful of times, you begin to really improve that skill. And then you get to a place where you're able to ride it. And once you learn how to ride a bike, it's really hard to unlearn it. And so you kind of have that, once again, that procedural memory stored in place. And once you do it, it's really, really locked in there well. This is associated with other physical things as well. So like walking, swimming, same thing. Some species are, but we as a species are not born with the innate capacity to just walk and swim. It is a skill that needs to be learned and developed, and it's typically learned and developed by practice and a little bit of failure along the way. And so that's how we hone in on that skill. But then once that skill is honed in on, once again, it's really hard to unlearn that skill. And so you will possess that for a very long time. We do the same thing now with our emotional memories too. And so our emotional memories fall under the same idea of a procedural or implicit memory, which is that it's not something that can just be explained. So you don't just sit a child down and say, here's how you handle your anxiety. Here's how you handle anger or sadness or joy or excitement. You don't just sit down and explain that. Sometimes we try, but these emotional responses, we learn them by experiencing them. We learn them by really kind of being in the moment with them. And this, perhaps even more than riding a bike, walking and swimming, we have modeled for us as well. We see how other people are handling it, and then we do the exact same thing. And if we do it a couple times and we get some type of desired response, all of a sudden we assume this is the way that we're supposed to handle it. And here's what's interesting. I use that term desired response. And it sounds like that means that we're like applauding them, like, oh, great job. Way to put your fist through a wall when you got upset, honey. Like, it doesn't mean that at all. But what a desired response is that either they felt good. And once again, hopefully a 2-year-old's not putting a fist through a wall, but, getting angry, yelling, screaming, that provides a little bit of an internal dopamine hit. It feels good in that moment. And so there's an internal reward by some of that anger. And then sometimes too, we then get attention. It's not necessarily positive attention, but we're then getting attention from an adult. And that feels really good as well. And so if we've seen kind of negative responses to emotions before, and then we do them and it kind of feels good in the moment, we get a lot of attention, we're in a good spot, and nobody's saying, here's a better way to do it. Nobody's modeling in that moment, here's a better way to do it. Then all of a sudden, we pretty quickly, just like learning how to ride a bike, learn that that's the way that I'm going to handle these things. And once we learn that, it is not impossible to unlearn it. I want to be crystal clear here. It's not impossible to unlearn it, but it takes a lot of time. And so what we're seeing here is just that that is a piece where it takes a whole lot of time to begin to kind of change and unlearn it. I want to give an example of what this looks like. I'm actually going to give one from the classroom, just because I think that it's a little bit more kind of crystal clear, cut and dry. And I don't want to bring up something that might have like a little bit more emotion or anything that tied to it, because I get that every child and family situation is a little bit different. But as a high school teacher, one of the things that I dealt with a lot with my students was that when they would get frustrated or angry, their immediate thing to do would be to use some pretty inappropriate language, and language that was not appropriate in an educational setting. So they're, using curse words, they're dropping the F word, things like that when they're getting frustrated. And one of the things that I began to learn fairly early on was when I would call them out on it, they'd be like, I didn't just say that. And the truth is, they likely didn't actually realize that they were utilizing some of the terms in that moment that they were utilizing. And what I began to understand as I learned more and more about the brain is that literally that was tied in. And especially in the situations where I got to meet their family and hear the way that their family spoke, it became pretty clear right away that when their family got upset, and perhaps a father, mother, siblings, language was spewed immediately. And that was a way that you handled a lot of frustration. That was kind of the first step to handling frustration. And so they had neural pathways that say, when you feel anger, anxious, stressed, say this, say that. And that's kind of the appropriate response there. And so what I think was kind of really important for me in that situation that I've now had to kind of utilize as a parent as well is beginning to realize that for whatever reason, that's what's wired in. That's how their brain is responding to this thing in that moment in time. And so that's there, and that it is not purposeful. They are not purposefully talking that way. They're not thinking, okay, I'm going to do it. I don't care what the rule is. I'm going to talk this way anyway. There's not that cognitive thought that exists there. Instead, it is an automated response to an emotion that they're feeling at that moment in time. And so it was really important for me to begin to really grasp that first and foremost. And that then was kind of what began the process of really thinking through, okay, how do I help them? How do I support them? And so one of my favorite things to kind of think about in terms of what this means and what this looks like is realizing that, once again, I talked earlier about our brains wanting to be efficient. And so when we think about the efficiencies of our brain, one of the things that our brain wants to do is to always take the straightest and easiest path possible to a destination. And the best comparison for that is this idea of like taking a highway. Whenever you travel, if you're driving, typically speaking, unless there's traffic, the fastest way to get from point A to point B is not going to be to take a bunch of back roads, not going to be to kind of blaze a trail through the jungle. It's going to be to hop on a highway and drive. You can drive far, you can drive fast, you can drive straight, and that is going to be the fastest way to get to most destinations. And so our brain does the same thing. It says, okay, here's what I'm feeling. Next step, this is what I do next. And so it takes these neural connections, these neural highways, if you will. And so almost immediately, whatever that ingrained response is going to be different. Or is going to be that. And so as a teacher in this scenario, I would say to them, hey, I'm sorry, I can't let you talk here. I can't let you use that type of language here. It's just not appropriate in a professional setting, in a school setting. And so that's not okay. And for the first couple of years of my teaching, I used to be very punitive about it, right? So, if you do it, then here's the consequences. And what I found was that those consequences weren't fixing anything, because they would just keep doing the exact same thing, but instead just get really upset about it when I was dishing out some consequences for it, because they didn't even realize it. Once again, how many times they would argue, I didn't say what you said I said. And it's like, no, you actually did. I actually heard you. I've got witnesses all around me. We all heard you say that thing. But once again, it wasn't this cognitive thought. And so the idea of using rewards and consequences to kind of stop that doesn't make sense. But it also is really helpful to realize that if they've never really been taught before not to talk that way, or they've never been taught that in an effective manner, the reality is when I'm saying to them, hey, you can't talk that way, their brain says, I want to take this path. And I'm telling them to take this path. I'm literally telling them to take a road that does not exist. I'm asking them to begin to blaze a new trail. And I think it's really important that we realize that this is what we're dealing with when we're trying to change a habit. Whatever it might be with a child, when we're trying to really change a habit for them, this is the path that we're then asking them to take. And it's a brand new path. It's a brand new procedure. It's a brand new way of thinking. And it is the opposite of what their brain automatically wants to do. And so what I said is, you know what? We're going to try something new here. Every time you use that inappropriate language, what I'm going to do is I'm going to calmly remind you that it's not okay to talk that way here. I'm going to raise your awareness of it. I'm not giving out consequences. I'm not yelling at you. I'm going to try to do it with the flattest affect that I possibly can, or even with a kind affect and jokingly, but I need to help to make you aware of it. So I said, every single time I hear it, I'm calling you out on it. But once again, I'm going to do that in a calm and supportive way. We're going to work through this together. And so literally what would happen is they would continue to use that language because it was an automated response to their emotions. And every time they did it, it's like, oh, hey, you said the F word again. Ooh, yep, we used that word again. Hey, bud, it happened again. And so I would be raising their awareness. And each time I would do that, that's like taking a machete and taking a few branches out on this path. And we begin to get a little bit further, then a little bit further, and a little bit further. And as we do that enough, we begin to blaze a new trail. Now, what I want to be crystal clear about here is that this is not like some perfect and quick solution. Even as you can see here, this new trail is not nearly as wide open as that highway we looked at 2 slides ago. But what we're seeing is that this new path is possible. And what this looks like in reality is that I might be kind of working with a child. I might be, once again, doing that reminder for a while. And then all of a sudden, what you find is that the next step is every so often when they curse, before I call them out on it, they say, "Ooh, I just said that. Oops, I just cursed. Oops, I just made that." And so once again, their awareness is beginning to grow. They're beginning to become more and more aware of the fact they're able to put that pause in there. They're able to realize what they did in that moment in time. And so as that begins to occur, then we're blazing that trail a little bit more. And then we get to this place where they start to curse and they say, oh, and they stop themselves. And so once again, that trail is now getting a little bit wider. And then they begin to stop it altogether. They begin to, give words that they can replace that language with and really get to a better spot. And so once again, our goal here is to begin to give them an alternative, give them another way to speak, another way to handle that challenging thing that they're trying to change, but realizing that it's literally about creating a new neural pathway in their brain to be able to handle things differently in a different environment. Now, it's also, to be clear, it's not going to be perfect 100% of the time. There would be days that they would catch themselves and others that they would still accidentally do it. And so there's kind of, that progress is not a perfect straight up line, but it has dips and it has ebbs and flows to it. And just because they have a bad day doesn't mean that all is lost. And so you can think about this with so many areas that you might be trying to help your children to improve, where it's not going to be perfect, but we really want to think, if this whole reward and consequence thing isn't working, it's time to really begin to think through, okay, how do I just friendly, in a friendly manner, help to make you aware, help to bring you that support, be really proactive about helping you to understand what you're doing and what a better alternative is. And so that's really a lot of what it looks like to be able to help a child through those things. But the good news is that, once again, that new path, creating that new highway is absolutely possible. But one of the most important things to understand about brain plasticity, about our brain's capacity to change, is that one of the key areas that they've discovered that really helps to promote positive brain change is existing in a supportive environment. And so being in a spot where our brain feels supported, where our brain feels loved and cared for, is when our brain can actually grow best. Because when we are stressed, that's when we're way more likely to go to our default modes. When we're under any amount of stress, when we feel untaken care of, when we feel like we're all on our own, that's when we are way more likely to kind of default to, okay, whatever's worked before, I'm going to do that again. Like when you're in a stressful situation, that's not the time to try to change something, to try to learn something new. That's the time to just buckle down and survive. And so creating a supportive environment, helping a child to feel as calm as possible is really, really important. And so I think it's really valuable that we think about the relationship that we have with the children within our care. And we realize, first off, it is inevitable that we're in relationship with them. Like if we are in their lives, we're in relationship with them. But it's also important to realize that just because we're in relationship with them, and just because we know that deep down we really love and care about them, does not mean that we're always having this positive impact on them. So there's this quote that I really like by Bruce Perry. It says, "Fire can warm or consume, water can quench or drown, wind can caress or cut. And so it is with human relationships. We can both create and destroy, nurture and terrorize, traumatize and heal each other." And so it's really just showing that there's two sides to that. And so the relationship that we have with our children or the children within our care, we can either have a really positive and amazing impact, and we can either purposefully or more often by accident have a really negative impact on them. And if we're in a place where we happen to be having more of a negative impact on them, we're really, for one, probably setting up more and more, unfortunately, bad neural connections in their brain. But secondly, we're not really setting them up to be in a place where positive growth is going to be very likely to occur. And so one of the first and most important things for us to really be considering is how we can really create a lot of positive relational experiences. And what we mean by that is that being really intentional about having just positive interactions, positive moments between ourselves and, once again, the children within our care. When we have those positive relational experiences, it reduces stress in the child. So it's going to set them up to be less stressed, set them up to be higher up in their brain. When they're higher up in their brain, that improves their neurodevelopment. So everything that we've been talking about up until now, the calmer you are, the easier it is to make those changes. The easier it is for your brain to learn new information and for your brain to feel safe enough to rewire from previous neural pathways to create new pathways for handling different things that they may be experiencing. And then one of the other pieces that is so incredibly important here is that it improves a child's self-worth as well. One of the things that we've been seeing more and more of with families and schools that we're working with is that more and more children are struggling with their own depression, anxiety, and a lot of that boils down to their own self-worth, how they feel about themselves, how much they actually value themselves. And so really creating these positive moments with a child goes a long way in helping them to actually feel good about themselves and like they are in a good spot. And so one of the challenges I like to really give families is to really think through, okay, over the course of the day, how can I have as many positive moments with my child as I possibly can? And so one of the things that I would really challenge you with is take a week, take a 5-day week. And what I'd really like to encourage you with is that every single day that week, assuming it's like a regular day and you're at work and they're at school and things like that. So you see them in the morning, most likely you likely see them in the afternoon for a few hours as well. Every single day, be super intentional about saying 25 positive things to them. 25 positive things to them. And that can be anything. That can be, in the morning, just like, hey, thanks for getting yourself up. Hey, good job clearing your plate. Could be, thanks for eating your food. And sometimes I tell this to folks and they say, yeah, well, they don't do any of those things. Everything's a battle. Everything's a fight. They say, okay, you might have to get a little bit more creative. And it might just be like, hey, I like your shirt. Hey, your smile looks so great today. Hey, I just love you so much. And just finding 25 and being super intentional about thinking, okay, 25 times today, but from the moment that child wakes up to the moment they go to bed, they're going to hear 25 things from me that are undeniably positive. Now, here's the thing. Every single situation is different. Some folks do this and they're like, that was a breeze. I did that before breakfast. And others, they're like, oh my goodness, that was such a challenge. Like I couldn't do it, or I had such a challenging time with it. And I think that that's really telling and important for us to realize how much they're actually hearing and what kind of the ratio is of positive to negative. what's important to realize is that for a child's brain, basic redirections, basic directions, even their brain might be perceiving that as negative. And so that's not on you, right? That's not completely your fault, but it is your problem. And what I mean by that is, of course, you need to give direction and redirection. You need to tell your child it's time to get up. You need to tell them to clear their plate. You might need to tell them to fill in the blank. Whatever all these things are that you expect them to do, you need to tell them that. I'm not just saying like let them go and do their own thing. Whatever the rules and expectations that you've established in your house are, you need to continue to do those things. But their brain might be perceiving that as negative interaction after negative interaction after negative interaction. And if we're not compensating that with a lot of positive as well, that's where kids are like, man, I don't have value. Man, I am so hated when I'm at home. I cannot tell you how many times I have talked to children and like, man, my parents hate me, or my parents don't care about me. They don't love me. And the truth is, there are some folks out there that might struggle a bit more, but the vast majority of parents I've met with, they love their kid, but the message just isn't getting there. And this is part of the reason why. All of the interactions are directives or redirectives, and they're not just there to build relationship and be supportive. And so the simple fact that you know you love your child, unfortunately, is not always enough for them to be feeling that love. And so once again, we just want to be super intentional about that and really taking time to share positive things with them and really build them up and make sure that we have as many positive experiences with them as we possibly can. But here's kind of the kicker with all this. The most challenging part of this is that if we are not regulated, if we are not calm, we're going to have a tough time being positive with them. We're going to have a tough time creating that positive environment with them. And so what's so interesting is that we need to be calm and regulated and in a good place to actually be able to create the best environment for our children to be able to regulate as well. In many ways, as the adult, we are the barometer for our children to be able to say, hey, now's a good time to be calm, or now isn't a very good time to be calm. Humans are relational creatures. And so part of that kind of relationship that we have is that we naturally look to the older people, we look to those in charge, and we look to them and say, am I safe or am I not safe right now? And our brain just naturally is going to do that. And so what happens is, especially for a child, they're looking at an adult. And if an adult seems cool, calm, and collected, that tells the child, okay, things are good. I can feel calm now as well. If the adult seems frantic and, kind of disoriented or worried or anxious or out of control, then that child's brain says, ooh, you're not safe right now. And it puts them into a lower state. And so what's important to realize is that we are, once again, the barometer for our children. This is not just kind of an interesting thought or theory. There's actual science behind this. We have these things in our brain called mirror neurons. These are neurons that fire when you see something occurring in the same way that they would fire if you were doing that thing yourself. And so if I were to, if you're in a room with people and somebody yawns, multiple people yawn as well. That's because of mirror neurons. If you walk down a hallway and smile at everybody, look them in the eye and smile, about 70% of people will automatically smile back at you. That's because of mirror neurons. Your brain sees it occurring and it automatically does that thing. Well, it's the same thing with your level of calm. If you are really able to be intentional about maintaining a high level of calmness, your children will look at you and they will be more calm in your presence. And that is one of the first and most valuable steps that we can take to being able to set up an environment where they are going to be likely to begin to calm down. And so being intentional about that with a child is what's really going to help to calm them down. One of the best things we can do to calm them down and put them in a good spot for their brain to change is to make sure that we ourselves are at our calmest first. And so with all that said, one of the best places to start, and once again, kind of reiterating a bit of what we've talked about up until now, is really starting out with this idea of positivity. If we're wanting our brains to positively change, if we're wanting our children's brains to be able to positively change, one of the things that we want to be super intentional about is creating this kind of level of positivity with them. And so as an adult, being positive towards them, saying positive things to them. This does a couple things for us, and it does a couple things for the child. For us, it helps us to see the child in a different light. So as we are intentional about finding the good in them, it's so obvious the things that they need to change, right? And sometimes we get so fixated on that. We're tired of them fighting with their sibling. We're tired of them not listening. We're tired of them not cleaning their room or doing their homework or whatever the myriad of things are that we might be kind of working for them to develop. And it's so easy to focus on those things. But when we choose to pinpoint the positive things that they're doing as well and to highlight those for them, that helps us to see them in a different light, and it helps us to actually feel better about them. When we do that, it actually releases calming chemicals in the brain, among others, the most popular being a dopamine hit that we get from doing that. And so what's interesting is that when we do, talks on self-care, one of the things that we talk about is that a great tool for self-care is actually being intentional about building other people up, encouraging other people, because the chemicals that we get in our brain from building others up helps to actually put us in a better spot. And so one of the best things we can do to cheer ourselves up is to go out and be intentional about helping others. And then as we are building them up, as we're being positive, that actually increases the likelihood that they're going to exhibit behaviors that are positive. We're relational creatures. The closer we feel connected, positively connected to those we're in relationship with, the more that we want to do things to please those people. And so as your child, obviously there's already a connection there, but as they in the moment feel more of a positive connection with you, they're going to be more likely to exhibit the behaviors that we're asking them to exhibit, and it's going to put them in a much, much better spot. And then from the children's perspective, to kind of move it over there a little bit, when we're positive with them, they feel far more seen and cared for by that parent. And so it begins to take away that feeling of I'm hated, they don't notice me, they don't care about me. When you begin to pinpoint the positive things in them, it really helps them to feel far more valued, far more seen and supported. And so it puts them in a much better emotional state. They are then going to see the environment that they're in as being far safer. And once again, I don't want that to be kind of triggering anybody when I talk about home feeling more safe. Most of your homes are probably very, very safe. I'm not trying to question that at all. But what I'm saying is that there's physical safety and there's emotional safety. And there's safety that our brain perceives when it's higher, and some of that dissolves as you get lower and lower in your brain. And so it's more about the brain feeling safe to take chances, safe to try something new, safe to grow. And so it's about the brain feeling far more kind of comfortable and confident and safe in a specific scenario or situation. And then once again, that releases these calming chemicals in the child's brain as well. And so as you're lifting them up, once again, dopamine hit, which is going to help them to begin to move higher up in their brain. Once again, feel calmer. And the calmer they feel, the more likely they're going to be able to stay calm and supportive. And so as we're thinking about supporting our children, supporting some of the positive changes that we're trying to see in them, one of the most important places to start is really being intentional about being positive with them, really being intentional about building them up. And so really, hopefully at the end of this, really thinking through, how do I make sure that they feel safe and supported as they possibly can, and being intentional about that and repeating whatever that is as often as possible. So whether it's that challenge that I shared and just jotting down, am I doing 25 positive things a day? Is it being intentional about spending more one-on-one time, making sure that you have interactions that aren't about what they need to do better, but highlighting the positive things, whatever that looks like. As you do that, that's what really sets the stage for a lot of positive growth. Because the reality is this, bringing this all back to this idea of plasticity, we talked through what it can look like to raise awareness of some of the things that you might want them to be able to change, and how to talk them through that and get them to kind of that destination. But you cannot get there. You're not going to see that change unless they feel safe, they feel calm and supported and valued by you. And so that's what we're trying to really piece together here. So with all that, once again, I really appreciate the opportunity to spend time with you all. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. You can email me, you can reach out to our website, you can reach out to us on social media. We're here to help. We're here to be a resource for you. So anything at all that we can do to help and support you, we'd be more than happy to do that. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.